A letter to my grandchildren. Dear grandchildren, I decided to write this when I was doing a genealogy study for my children. As I wrote down my grandparents' and my great-grandparents' names, when they were born and when they died, I began to wonder just what kind of people they really were. The data I gathered seemed to be the most insignificant thing about them. Now I might like you to think I was a sweet little old lady who smiled all day and crocheted pretty doilies and did nothing but bake cookies, but let me tell you the truth. I am, or was, a living human being with all the fallacies of most people of the human race. Let me tell you a little of my story. I was born in Collinsworth County, Texas, in the little community of Quail, near Wellington, Texas, December the 12th, 1922. Since I was only 1 year old when we left there, my memories are of other times and places. I was the youngest of 5 children, 4 girls and 1 boy. My brother Joe was just 3 years older than I. We moved to New Mexico in February of 1924. We came by train. Cattle, horses, mules, farm machinery, wagons, household goods, grain, and enough food for 1 year was sent by rail car. Papa rode with them. Mama, we children, and Grandma Drake came by passenger train. New Mexico, even in 1924, was still a wild, raw land, mostly big ranchers whose only claim to the ground was that their herds grazed it. 2 of Mama's uncles had come out to Lincoln County shortly after World War I and had taken up homesteads near Jack's Peak. I remember Aunt Minnie telling about living in a tent and having to punch a wildcat off of it with a broomstick. Uncle Les wrote to Grandpa telling him about the county and wanting him and Grandma to come out there. But my grandparents were happy where they were situated. Most of their children were married and settled around them. Mama and Papa had been sharecropping on one of Mama's cousin's places. The cousin was a lawyer in Wellington and seemed to end up with quite a number of farms. I don't know all the details, but I always got the feeling he operated on the fringe of the law himself. Anyway, Mama wanted a place of their own and talked Papa into making the move. All the relatives tried to talk her out of it, as they were sure all we children would either starve to death or be killed by the Mexicans. When my family, I was only 1 year old, reached New Mexico, the train stopped at Luna, which was only a pump station on the rail line, and let us off. It was a cold February night, and Uncle S was to have met us with his wagon and team, but his horses had run off, so it wasn't until the next morning that he came for us. We walked, I'm sure I was carried, about 1/2 mile up to J.R. Hall's ranch to take shelter for the night. There were not enough beds, so everyone but the smallest of we children sat up. Lucille kept going to sleep and falling off the trunk she was sitting on. Lavona was 17 at the time and took care of me. She said I was train sick all the way from Texas to New Mexico and kept vomiting all over both of us, and she kept cleaning me up. Mom and Grandma were both sick too. The cold smoke and fumes would settle in the cars, and then, having only ridden in a buggy or wagon, the jerky motion and speed of the train had devastating effects. The next morning, Uncle S was able to catch his team and come after us. Another family came with us from Texas, the Davises. Mr. Davis and their 3 older boys were riding the freight train with Papa, and they also had their farm animals and tools with them. Their train didn't arrive until several days later. Their younger children and Mrs. Davis were with us on the passenger train. The older Davis boys rode on the freight train to save the price of their passage. Each time the train stopped, the boys hid for fear a railroad bull would catch them and throw them off. The next day dawned cold and dreary with a light crust of snow on the ground. Uncle S was going to move us all into Uncle Charlie's house for the winter. Uncle Charlie and Aunt Maud had moved into Captown for a while so their 3 children could attend school. The wagon was loaded with bags, baggage, Grandma Drake, Mrs. Davis, and the younger children, all except me. Lavona said I cried and wouldn't stay on the wagon, so she had to walk and carry me all the way up Luna Hill, which is a good 4 miles and up grade all the way. Mama, Lavona, and all the rest settled in. In a short while, Papa and all the animals arrived. The Davises moved on over to the old Wilson place until they could build a tar paper house on their homestead. We stayed on Uncle Charlie's place until after the next Christmas. Lucille tells me it was the first big Christmas she could remember. Mom and Papa gave a community Christmas and invited everyone. The snow lay deep and clean and clung heavily on the boughs of the cedar and pinon trees. People came from miles around, in wagons, on horseback, and some even walked. No one had much money for gifts, but just to be with the neighbors and to visit with each other in this sparsely peopled land. Lucille remembers a crisp, clear starlit night shining on the snow. It was her first time to tie Christ in with Christmas. Uncle Les and Aunt Minnie decided to go to Uncle Joe's near Portales, New Mexico, to work for a year. We then moved to their place, which was located at the foot of Jack's Peak. Papa cut wood in the forest with Mama and Lavona's help. He would haul it to Ancho, where it was loaded on the train and shipped to El Paso, Texas, for sale in the wood yards. In the meantime, they also went searching for a section of land they liked. They decided upon 640 acres of prairie grass about 5 miles from Uncle Les's, but close enough to the woods to provide the fuel that would be needed. Papa also liked the openness of the prairie. He didn't like being shut in by the trees. The year at the foot of Jack's Peak in the woods proved to be a very difficult one. Most of the children were seriously ill with the flu and whooping cough. I'm sure about this time Mama might have had a few serious doubts about her decision to move to such a remote area. I'm also very sure she didn't take too much time brooding over it. Mama had the courage of a lion as well as versed in the art of home remedies. People came to her when they had serious illnesses in their homes. A number of children born in the country at this time was delivered by my mother. Papa was equally courageous and physically very strong. I never saw his authority really challenged by anyone, except Mama, that is. I've seen him tackle tasks that would have been impossible for the ordinary man or take time to mend the smallest toy. I remember the night Grandma died. Someone knocked my one and only doll out of a chair and broke its head in two. I remember Papa stuffing the head full of cotton and binding it back together. She always looked as if she had a terrific headache after that, and to my young mind the two terrible calf strokes were always tied together. I didn't see Grandma until after Mama and the others had bathed and dressed her in her best black silk. I remember seeing her lying on 2 covered boards laid across 2 sawhorses, and the shock of seeing the $50 laid on her eyelids where her eyes should have been is still embedded in my mind. Undertakers were a luxury unaffordable in this time and were too far away to have been usable. I know many of the time Mama was out, either sitting up with the sick or helping lay out the dead. Now I'm getting a little ahead of my story, but I wanted you children to get a little insight into the inner workings of a family, or at least my family in those pioneer times. The folks bought an old house that was sitting over near the railroad at Tecolote. It had been there since the time the railroad was built. They moved it over to the homestead. It had neither windows or doors, and there was a gaping hole where the fireplace would have to be eventually replaced. We were living back on Uncle Charlie's place by then, and the day arrived that we had to start sleeping on the place to prove up on our homestead. Papa was still living in the forest and cutting wood, so it fell to Mama, Lavona, and the rest of we children to start sleeping in. Lavona relates to me the first day. She and Mama took the team of mules, who were called Mike and Henry, along with Joe and I, and went to the south well to haul a 500-gallon tank of water for the stock. Mike and Henry were the high-spirited pair of mules, and just as they got the well and all loaded with water, something spooked them and they ran away. They tore off across the prairie with Mama sawing on the reins and Lavona sitting on top of the tank trying to hold Joe and I and keep us from falling off. Needless to say, mules are not particular which route they take when they decide to run. After bouncing over bare grass humps, broom weeds, and cactus for about a mile, Mama finally got them under control. Papa had the other mules, Jack and Jerry, in the forest with him. They unloaded the water and loaded the wagon with stumps, bedding, and necessities, and finished just as Lolly and Lucille came in from school. We started for the homestead. Just at dusk, as we topped the last rise, the full moon came up, and there is no moon so big or as bright as on the high, dry, clear air of central New Mexico. Before unhitching the team, Mama and Lavona bedded we children down in the old house and went back to unload the stumps in the moonlight. The coyotes had set up their nightly chorus all around, and everything had an eerie and isolated feeling. The mules even seemed nervous and uneasy. They had only gotten a few of the stumps unloaded, and Lavona was standing in the back of the wagon. Suddenly a horned owl on the roof of the house let out a big hoot. With this, the mules gave a jump, jerking the wagon, and Lavona went out backwards, cutting a big gash in the back of her head on a stump. Mama did the best she could to stop the bleeding, and they unhitched the mules and tied them to the wagon wheels. They then went in, made themselves a pallet, and tried to sleep. But the coyotes kept howling. Several of the owl's friends had joined him in the discussion of the newcomers, and the mules were still restless and kept rubbing their chains against the wagon wheels. By this time, Lavona's head was just throbbing. Mama said she had a can of kerosene under the house, and she thought maybe if she put a little of that on Lavona's head, it would help. When she went to get it, the Mexican sheep herders who roamed the area had been there and stolen it. Frankly, I think they might have been a godsend. Anyway, they got we children back in the wagon, the team hitched, and we were back at Uncle Charlie's by daylight. The house was eventually finished. Uncle S. built a fireplace. He and Uncle Charlie were really Mama's uncles, but when I was young, they were the only uncles I knew. Because of the sheep's continuous intrusion, Papa first plowed a furrow around our place. He then went to the ranch headquarters and gave the sheepmen orders to keep his sheep outside this furrow. I guess after looking at Papa, who stood 6 foot 2 inches, and listening to him, he decided it was a good idea, for he did so. Barbed wire was ordered, and Papa erected the first barbed wire fence in that part of the country. From the front of our house south, we looked at Jack's Peak and the Capitan Mountains. To the northwest, we could see the Guianas, and to the northeast, the Asper's Canyon cut across our property. In rainy times, this canyon carried water all the way to the Pecos River. I remember one time we 4 younger ones were out after the cows, bringing them home for milking, and the sky just turned black. Thunder and lightning was crashing all around us, and the rain and hail came down in torrents. Lolly and Joe ran home and got there soon after the real storm broke, but Lucille and I sat on top of a sagebrush mound with a raincoat over our head while all hell's fury broke around us. Lucille prayed through it all. When the rain subsided, we got up and started on home. We met Papa coming to look for us. It was a good thing he did, because a small arroyo that was usually dry was running very swift. We had to cross it, and I was completely swept off my feet, and only by Papa hanging onto my hand and setting me up on his shoulder could I have made it. Mama's health broke soon after we moved over on the prairie. The doctor was telegraphed for and came from 50 miles away. He said she had a nervous breakdown, but nothing he gave her seemed to help. Her illness just seemed to linger on. An old druggist at Corona finally sent out some medicine called SOMNOS, which brought her out of it. I now know that this was a strong opium concoction, but it really did the job and didn't leave her a dope addict either. Ever after that, our house was never without this mixture, and we all got a few doses to cure whatever ailed us. Lavona had always taken care of me and was always at my beck and call. I always slept with her, and it was a very traumatic experience for me at 6 years of age when she got married. When I had been 4, she had been going with a different boy, and I threatened her with the fact that if she married Dude, I was going to marry the old man, his father, so I could still sleep with her. Papa turned under about 100 acres of grassland, plowed it and seeded it to crops. We grew corn, high gear, cane, and beans. Mama had about 2 acres in garden closer to the house. On this we raised our household vegetables and the sweet corn for table use. It seemed that every Thanksgiving Day we were either shocking feed or gathering corn. I always envied the Pilgrims who had time to have a big dinner. We were lucky to have a pot of beans and biscuits, as this was our busy season. The beans had long since been windrowed, hauled to the thrashing machine, and thrashed. This was our one money crop. My job was always on the end of the thrasher where the hulls, vines, dirts, and dead grasshoppers were thrown out in my face. My religion was always rather low-key on these days. I had to pick this up with a pitchfork and throw it in a stack, as it made great winter feed for the cattle. The other kids always assured me this was the best job for me, their reason being that I was the littlest and the tail end of the thrasher was the farthest from the dangerous parts, such as the belt that ran to the engine. I always took this with a grain of salt. I knew I always came out with the blackest face and the most itch down my collar. Now, children, don't let me mislead you. I probably did much less of the farm work than any of the others. I was a professional when it came to gold bricking. I wasn't born without a brain, and I knew that out of sight was out of mind. I would sit halfway down the cellar steps, just far enough to where my head wouldn't appear above ground, so Mama couldn't see me, and I read everything I could lay my hands on. such as Elsie Dinsmore, Lavender and Old Lace, true romance magazines, and the best literature people cared to throw away. I would have gone down the cellar, but once while we were playing paper dolls down there, a rattlesnake fell out of the ceiling into our make-believe dollhouse, and I never trusted that roof again. Now, my father was a pretty smart papa. He knew how much Joe liked to hear stories but hated to read, and he knew how much I liked to read but hated to work. So he put 2 seats on the cultivators. We spent many a hot summer day going up and down the long rows of beans and corn. We wore wide-brimmed felt sombreros. They kept the sun out of our faces but turned our scalps into a boiling cauldron. Sweat would streak down our faces, making rivulets through the dirt cast up by the plow. I would read him the Wild West Weekly. We thrilled to the wild exploits of Billy West in his shoot-'em-up, knock-'em-down, and drag-'em-out adventures. The old mules would snort their disgust. I'm sure no self-respecting farm animal ever had to listen to such goings-on. They seemed to retaliate at each end of the road by stepping across their trace chains. We'd have to interrupt our adventures, come back to earth, and get their feet in the right places again. Our religious instruction was not ignored either. My father was a staunch Baptist, and my mother was a staunch Methodist. We took in every itinerant missionary that came through the country, be whatever religious sect. Some of them were fine, dedicated preachers, and some of them, I decided, were just too lazy to work. My mother always set them down to an ample table. Fried chicken, hot biscuits, gravy, butter and jam for breakfast, the other meals equally replete with cakes and pies added. One summer we had had just a little more than our share of the hell's fire and damnation kind of soul savers. At least my brother Joe and I felt so. The last to arrive was a minister, his son, and 2 wives. I beg your pardon, his wife and 2 sons. They had been... You better shut that off. I was a minister, his wife, and 2 sons. They had been with us about a week. We attended their meetings every night in the Ancho schoolhouse. At night, this man was a foot-stomping, arm-waving, shouting kind of a preacher. If he couldn't love you into heaven, he sure tried to scare you out of hell. But by day, he laid on the bed all day and slept, and only came out to partake of Mama's repast. The boys were equally lazy and lay around on the beds with Mama's best quilts on them, which we children weren't even allowed to sit on. When we would come in from the fields after hoeing weeds all day in the hot sun, they were nice and fresh and wanted to come out to play. Well, this evening we were playing keep away, and somehow instead of the ball, Joe got the bigger kid's black hat. He was bigger than us. Joe tossed it to me and yelled, "Put it in the skunk pen." And since I was always such an obedient child, I did just as he said. Now I'll have to tell you about our skunks. Joe had found a den of baby skunks and had brought them home. He and I had tried our hand at descenting them, but our surgical skills being what they were, they had grown up to be quite normal. Well, that hat must have looked like some varmint that was their worst kind of enemy, for they'd done it in. That hat must have been a big factor in that preacher's life, too, for the first thing he shouted was, "We'll have to bury it," and his face looked like it might have been blistered by a little of all that fire he'd been preaching about. He grabbed his family, bags and baggage, and took off in a cloud of dust. Joe and I just knew that razor strap was going to come out from behind the kitchen door and be put to good use. But the folks just ignored us and acted like it was just an everyday occurrence. But I knew it wasn't, because we just didn't have that many visitors, especially a preacher that hadn't even said a prayer before he left. Papa bought a 1923 Chevrolet truck, built a covered bed on the back with a window on each side, and started driving the school bus. The covered area of the truck was built with wooden benches around it. During the cold winter months, the folks would heat fire bricks and flat irons in the fireplace and put them in an old gold digger's pan, then place them between the 2 rows of benches, which would help keep our feet warm. Mom always set plenty of quilts along also so that we could cover up. The bus route was about 25 miles long over 2 rutted roads. And the snows in winter at that high elevation can come suddenly and can be several feet deep in a few hours' time. Lavona drove the bus too if it was necessary for Papa to be busy on the farm. My first day of school was catastrophic. There were only two little Mexican boys and myself in my class. Jose and Marcus kept pulling my hair when the teacher wasn't looking. I got enough of it, so I just got up and walked out of the room and went in and sat in the same seat with my sister Lucille, who was in the 8th grade. Nothing anyone said could persuade me to return. I eventually became regimented to school life, and for my grades I guess I became what you might call an apt scholar. Our school was only a 2-room school to begin with, but more homesteaders kept moving into the area, and someone burned the schoolhouse down east of Ancho. It was only speculation, but the story was that a certain man's bull tore down his neighbor's fence, and the bull got in the cornfield and the neighbor shot it. Since the wife of the man who shot the bull was the teacher at the school, it was said that the owner of the bull burned down the schoolhouse. The county decided to bus those kids to Ancho, and we became a 4-room school. Up until the 5th grade, I thought boys were only someone to ignore or do battle with, whichever the occasion demanded. But when my brother was in the 7th grade, he became best friends with a new boy in the country named Gayle Cathey. Easter rolled around and Bill walked by my desk and put a little yellow chicken on it. Boom, I was in love with all the order a 10-year-old could muster. My romance was short-lived, though, as he soon moved his attention on to more mature subjects. For the next 3 years, I relegated myself to the prospect of being an old maid for life. Bill and Joe remained best of friends for the rest of their life. Joe was killed in an airplane crash when he was 27, which is another story in itself. Now back to the ranch. Our place now contained 2,240 acres. Before Grandma died, she had filed and proved up on 640 acres to our west. Lavona, after turning 21, had taken 640 acres to our east. Papa bought 320 acres to the north of Grandma's section. We now milk between 35 and 40 head of cows. Papa and Mama separated the milk, and we shipped the cream to Denver, Colorado, or Wichita, Kansas, whichever creamery was paying the highest price at the time. We carried the cream to Ancho to the train station. The next train going that way picked it up and returned our empty cans from the cream that had been shipped the week before. It now seemed that most of my life, when I wasn't in school, consisted of sitting under an old cow and pulling her tits. I had my own escape hatch, though. I got to where I could dream, telling myself stories in my head, through the milking of many an old cow without being interrupted. This was difficult in the spring, however, when the grass was green. The cows would come home with their tails saturated with fresh, slimy manure, and one slap across the face with this repulsive fly swatter could interrupt the most fanciful of stories. It would take me quite a while to regain my composure and remember where I left off. Life was not all drudgery, though. We had parties, singing conventions, Bible school, church. The missionaries kept coming. And Mama had her Ladies' Aid Society. I never did know what they aided, but I guess it was each other, just to get together and exchange all the latest gossip and eat the special desserts they always fixed. I remember once while it was being held at our house, Joe and I and the Wilson boys climbed up on the roof, and since it was made of sheet iron, it made a great slide. We could come sweeping down off the main house and catch ourselves on the porch before we went over the edge. Mama had bought me my first store-bought pair of pink silk panties. She had always made them out of flour sacks before, and if I'd stooped over far enough, you could have read gold medal stamped across my seat. As I came swooping down the roof, I had picked a spot where a nail had worked its way up. This nail just reached up and took a big chunk of that pretty pink silk right off my bottom. And that was not all it got either, but I knew the skin would grow back. Again, I just knew I was going to get it. I was fooled. Mama must have had a good time that day and didn't want to upset herself. It seemed like I was always getting it when I least expected it and not getting it when I knew I deserved it. This kind of action always kept me a confused kid. Maybe this is the reason I grew up always thinking a little different from those around me. Lucy and Lolly were now grown up, and there were always a lot of boyfriends coming to call. The Dale boys always brought chewing gum, and I always ended up with a chew. I never knew if this was a bribe or just to keep my mouth shut. I liked to see them come the best because I figured if they had the gum, they had to be the richest of the lot. I didn't like either one of my sisters very much at this time. Lucille had quit telling us stories, and Lolly treated me with just a little less concern than she did the dust on her pretty little high-heeled shoes that she tripped around in. Mama always ordered our school clothes once a year, and I had just about got her talked into letting me have a pair of waistband pants when Lolly spoke up and said, "She can't keep them up. She doesn't have any hips." And with that, I was doomed to overalls for another year. If thoughts could have killed, Lolly would have sizzled up like a piece of bacon and disappeared in a puff of smoke. My sisters went to dances, had pie suppers, and box socials. The box socials consisted of fixing supper in a box and decorating it up real pretty. It was then auctioned off. The man who bid the most money for your box you shared your supper with. They were not supposed to know whose box belonged to whom, but I think there might have been a few whispered consultations before it all started, for the boys seemed to usually end up with the girls of their choice. We younger kids just sat around and watched them eat. We'd been fed far less exotic things before leaving home. This one night we were having a big entertainment and box social at the schoolhouse. Lucille and Lolly always took part in the program as Lucille played the guitar and they sang together. I asked Mama if I could take a box too, not to auction off, but just so Papa and I could have something to eat while all the rest were indulging. Papa liked to eat too, and I'd gotten tired of just sitting and watching and not ever getting a crumb. Mama said I could, so I found one of their old boxes that the crepe paper and flowers were a little wilted and faded, and proceeded to make us a supper out of the leftovers. The girls had used all the good parts of the store-bought light bread, but there were a couple of heels left over. I made a sandwich out of them, and I found a big cold biscuit, too. When Mama made bread, after she'd cut out the smaller biscuits, she'd gather together the little triangles of dough that were left, knead them together, and make one big biscuit. This was usually for the dog, but I figured this would be just about right for Papa. So I made him a sandwich out of that, and it looked like a big fat terrapin. If it had had legs, I'm sure it would have crawled off. When I went in the schoolhouse, I put my box behind me, covered it over with my coat, and sat docilely through all the auction. My supposedly best friend knew what I'd done, and just as the last box was taken by the highest bidder, she grabbed my box and yelled, "Here's another one." I got that box back from her, but I can still remember the absolute terror and the sickness in the pit of my stomach as I saw that man walking across the floor toward me. He wrestled that box out of my hands with me resisting, but I managed to get a good kick into the pit of his stomach. Needless to say, my box went up for auction. I think it went for the highest bid of all. It went to a young man who was postmaster at the time. I thought him to be the most handsome and most sophisticated man around Ancho. He was somewhere the age between Lucille and Lavona. I would have just run off and hid, but I kept thinking about that horrible biscuit in that box, and I knew I just had to rescue him from it. Thank goodness he had bought someone else's box too, and while he was helping open her box, I slipped the lid off of my box and took out that big biscuit and tried to delicately hide it in my hands, which was an impossible feat. The next best thing to hide it from the world, I decided, was to eat it. I think the more I ate, the bigger it got. It would go down and hit my stomach, which was already tied in knots like chunks of concrete. Anyway, I ate it, and I'd done away with that biscuit, after which I retired to the sanctuary of Papa's school bus, lay down on the floor, wrapped myself in a quilt, and let the rest of them enjoy their social without me. You better turn it off for a second. Rattlesnakes were a big problem. It seemed some of the cows were bitten several times, but they never died. They couldn't eat and got a little thin before the swelling went down. One morning, Papa and Joe were going after the horses. As they walked across the field to get to the pasture, just as Joe stepped across a row of corn, his foot came down right on top of a rattlesnake, which jumped and bit him on the leg. Papa took out his knife and lanced it, cutting across in both directions, and took his shoelace and made a tourniquet above his knee. He rushed home and got the car. Mama got her can of permanganate potash that she kept on a little shelf in the feed room. This was kept for snake bites, and a can of kerosene and some towels. They gathered Joe up and took him the 50 miles to the doctor. On the way, Mama put the potash on the wound and kept pouring kerosene over it. She had Joe's leg across her lap, and I remember both Mama's legs being so blistered from the kerosene that afterwards she could hardly walk. In the meantime, Lolly ran all the way to Lavona's house to tell them about it. Lavona's brother-in-law got in his car and went to Luna and telegraphed the doctor that they were coming. This was a good thing because the doctor was out of snake serum and had to go to the Obar-O-Dude Ranch to borrow some. The doctor got back to his office at the same time as my folks drove in with Joe. He gave Joe the serum and used a vacuum machine to draw out as much poison as he could. When they got home, Joe's leg was bandaged and had swollen almost as big as his body. He was on crutches for quite some time. I felt sorry for him, but I was a little envious of him, too, because he'd got to see the inside of a doctor's office and got so much attention from everyone. Joe always teased me unmercifully. I was such a gullible child and swallowed everything he said, hook, line, and sinker. Nothing delighted him more than to pull some prank that would leave me with my face hanging out. We could also be best buddies, too. Once we hitched a young colt to our little red wagon, thinking we were going to teach him to pull.
I held the colt while Joe did the hooking up. Joe took the reins to drive him and I turned him loose. He just went berserk. He tore round and round the bean stack, the wagon only hitting the ground and rolling over and over at the corners. We had to run for our lives. The wagon had become
airborne, traveling at that speed and whipping in all directions. Papa heard the commotion from the house, came running out and rescued the poor little frightened animal. He gave us a few choice words as to the logic of our endeavor, and when Papa was angry, he could cut you right down to the size of an ant. My eyes when I was young was something of a brilliant green in color, and Joe would tell me I had snake eyes. I would gaze in the cracked mirror. One of the girls had set the kerosene lamp too close to it when they were heating their curling iron, and I would wonder where the folks had gotten me. I knew no one else in the family had eyes like that. Before Lavona married and left home, she always cut my hair. She would set me down between her feet, clamp my neck between her knees so I couldn't wiggle, and proceed with the cutting. I remember the terrible pain of her pressure points. The more I'd try to get relief, the harder she'd squeeze. I'd emerge with shorn hair, popped eyeballs, and tongue hanging out. That's the way I felt anyway. She was also my beautician. She would light a kerosene lamp, stick the crimpers down the globe, and just before they got red hot, she would take them out and crimp my hair into waves. I could hear the hair singeing, and the smell was the same one I got as when we were branding calves. I don't think she missed many times getting one of my earlobes caught in with the hair either. I just knew I'd have crimped ears for life. It was a very painful experience just to be pretty, and at that age being pretty was just about the least of my interests. Most of the time, though, I was left to my own devices, as long as I washed my face, hands, and combed my hair before they had to look at me across the dinner table. Our shoes came off as soon as the weather turned warm and were not put back on, except on special occasions or until school started in the fall. I had many painful experiences when I inadvertently wandered too close to a cactus. A few times we stepped on nails, too, and would have to sit soaking our foot in kerosene. When Papa made our outhouse, he made a 3-holer, 2 high ones and 1 low one for we little ones. This was really luxurious, as most everyone else only had a 1-holer. Ours was made out of used sheet iron. There were nail holes left in the tin, and while sitting on the seat, you always kept one eye looking out of one of these holes. If you didn't, there was a chance that one of the other kids would heave a rock and hit the building. If this happened and you weren't expecting it, the explosion and reverberations of that tin building could leave your nerves shattered for the rest of the day. Mama traded a dozen hens for a young horse, which we called Ace. He was really Joe's horse, but I rode him all the time, too. The first time I rode him, he ran away with me, and we tore across the prairie for miles before he had had his fill. He never ran away with me again, but we had several partings of the ways. He was a good cow pony and could turn on a dime if a cow dodged behind him. I usually rode him Indian fashion without a saddle, and we would be running after a cow. She would dodge back, and he would follow, and I would proceed in the original direction with painful consequences. None of us ever had broken limbs. I guess all that milk we drank kept our bones in good shape. We took many a fall and scrape, but always mended in the natural way, a new layer of skin. Life was quite idealistic for a child. After our work was done, there was time to read and dream and play. In the long, lazy days of the summer, we would wander over the prairies, picking an abundance of wildflowers and taking them home to Mama. In those days, the rains came regularly, and the hills blossomed in a magnitude of soft colors. The tall blue flax, the soft rose of wild pink, low-growing purple sweet williams. There were yellows, whites, and along the banks of the canyon, the red of Indian paintbrush could be found. In the early spring, the cactus bloomed in such profusion that it was like a giant rose garden of pinks and yellows. The soft white clouds floated against the azure blue sky. They were always changing shapes. Sometimes they were just soft cotton balls, and then herds of white buffalo would trace across the sky, or maybe a white horse with mane and tail flying in the wind. We'd each try to find a different picture to point out to the others. In the summer, we would make our beds out under the peach trees. We would gaze up into the soft, starry night and make wishes if a star fell, making a bright trail of light across the sky. The night winds whispered softly in the leaves over our heads, singing a soft lullaby. The only thing to mar our heavenly bed was the fact that little spiders would occasionally drop out of the trees and onto our faces. Lolly married Fred Dale, and Lucille left for a year to go back to live in Washington, D.C. with a cousin. The family was diminishing, and I didn't like the feel of being in focus. I had enjoyed the protective coloration of being a small cog in the wheel of a big family. I was maturing and growing up. My friends were beginning to try to act suave and sophisticated. I felt like a square peg in a round hole. Growing up is a very complicated and traumatic time. Sometimes I didn't understand myself. One day I was trying to act like a lady, and the next I would be back swinging from the rafters in the barn. Growing up is a lot like dying, except much more painful. You have to do both by yourself, but to die, I'm sure, is much less painless. You only have physical pain for a time, and no one else can take a hand in that. Growing up, it seems everyone is trying to get in on the act. You're fooled by your parents as to what is fit and proper. The neighbors are always keeping an eye on you to see if you turn out good or bad, and I always felt they were secretly hoping it would be bad so they'd have more to talk about. The kids at school put you down. I guess this is helping to build their ego up so they can withstand their own problems. You, in turn, retaliate in kind, so the cycle goes on and on. Children can be quite cruel animals. Just like in the jungle, it's the survival of the fittest, and to survive, you have to fight back. I don't necessarily mean physically, but literally. I guess this is good training for the rest of your life. Or for adults who are just the same children who have just grown older and a little wiser. Shakespeare wrote, "All the world's a stage and all the men and women merely players." I know so well how true this is. I have changed my costume so many times. I've played the part of child, young adult, wife, mother, and grandmother. My costume has changed with every role, but deep inside that little spark remains that is me. It makes me a little different from all the rest, just like you are you and there's nobody like you. Lucille came home from Washington, D.C. I was a little in awe of her for a time. She had the look, the talk, and the smell of the big city. She brought many mementos home with her and kept me spellbound with her stories of what she'd seen and done. I'd never been anywhere except back to Texas to visit the relatives. I was 9 years old when we made our first trek back there, and I laid eyes on this part of the clan. Mama had 4 brothers and 3 sisters and all of their families there. I felt they thought I was a wild little Indian, even though the folks had stopped in some little town and I'd been given a permanent. I'm sure I did nothing to dispel this feeling, though, when I whipped one of my boy cousins, who was the same age as my brother, out behind Uncle Allen's potato house. I know he cried and went to his mother, and I got the proverbial tongue lashing of my life. The rest of the cousins and Joe and I got along great. They were as rough as we were. They were all boys. I didn't have a girl cousin my age. I remember going to school with a neighbor girl of my aunt's in East Texas, and the teacher making a big thing out of the fact that I was from way out in New Mexico. They had me get up and tell something about my school. I told them it was about the same as theirs, except some of the small children had to come to school to learn to speak English. The kids kept asking me if everyone didn't still wear guns and the Mexicans carry long knives. Even though this was partially true, I thought they were really stupid. I saw grown people in Texas going to town barefooted, and I knew no adult went without shoes in New Mexico. My first time to play hooky from school was April Fool's Day after I'd turned 12. Several of us decided to play a joke and skip school for the afternoon. We walked over to the old brick plant and spent a few hours looking over the old derelict machinery. There was one big wheel we could climb up on, and our weight would make it turn. We could land on a platform down below. This was great fun. We felt very brave and daring. We knew the rest of the kids at school were all envious of us. The next day, the teachers had their own special joke to play on us as punishment. The night before, they had written our names on a brick and carried each of them out a different road about a mile from school. We had to walk until we found the brick with our name on it and carry it back. Mine was out past the cemetery quite some distance. When we got back to school, we had to stand up on the stage with our brick and sing this little ditty 3 times to the tune of Jingle Bells. We like bricks, we like bricks, we like bricks, we say, but we had rather leave them be until some other day. After we had finished our song, we had to sit on the brick and do our lessons for the rest of the day. The other kids at school thoroughly enjoyed our discomfort. Jack's Peak was always our favorite place for picnics. At the close of school each year, all the parents, teachers, and children gathered at the foot of the mountain for the day. We played baseball, had sack races, played dare base. The children would climb the mountain. Only the stronger boys ever made it to the top, and they would push rocks over the cliff. We could hear them come crashing down the mountainside. The parents always brought tons of food, and it always tasted so good, mingled with the smell of the pine and pinon. Jack's Peak was named after a bandit called Black Jack, who robbed stagecoaches and trader wagons on the old Spanish Trail. The trail ran very close to the foot of the mountain. We spent many an hour searching out the caves and nooks and crannies looking for his cache of gold. This peak was supposed to have been his hideout, and there were all kinds of fanciful stories about the hidden treasures to be found. We did find arrowheads and much pottery shreds from the Indians who had occupied it before Black Jack. There were many rocks on the slope of the peak that were as big as houses. One was our special favorite. It had another big rock balanced on top of it, and deep depressions in its top that were always filled with water. We called them Indian wells. And I think this could very well have been, as the pottery shreds were always especially thick around its base. On a hot summer day, we could sit in the shade of the balanced rock and drink cold water out of the wells. By late summer, though, the water would become infested with wiggletails. You had your choice of straining them through your teeth or remaining thirsty. I'd usually go home with a dry mouth. At home, our cistern was about 20 feet deep. It was just a hole with the sides and bottom concreted to about 3 feet above ground. We had gutters running from the roof of the house into it through a charcoal-filtered basin. The water was always clear, cold, and sweet. We used this for drinking and all our household needs. We pulled the water up with a bucket on a rope and a pulley. Our well was 640 feet deep. The water in it was full of minerals, and if you got a drink from the pipe running into the stock tank, you had to chew a while to get it down. Our windmill was made of huge timbers topped by a big wooden wheel. The wheel was 20 feet across and made of wooden fins. The fins were set at just the right angle to catch the wind. There was a big wind vane protruding from it, which held the wheel into the wind. If the winds became too strong, the wheel had to be turned away from it. This was done by another smaller wind vane. This vane was set offside, which would set the wheel off-center with respect to the vertical yaw axis. Thus, the wind pressure tends to turn the mill on its vertical axis, reducing the effective area and therefore the speed as the wind increases. This first type was introduced in the United States in about 1854. The device was supposed to be reliable and simple, but I can remember many a time its brain became confused and we had wooden sails scattered over quite an area. It was always a big job replacing them. Papa piped water to the garden from the well, but many an hour I spent carrying buckets of water from it to Mama's flowers in the yard. We always had beds of hollyhocks, zinnias, cosmos, and roses, and I could only thank goodness that Mama didn't decide to have a lawn as well. We had cherry, peach, and apple trees and a grape arbor that produced an abundance of the sourest grapes ever grown. They looked so delicious, but by the time you got your mouth unpuckered, you forgot how hungry you were for them. Mama made jelly out of the grapes, and even the jelly had a distinctive flavor. It was hard to distinguish it from the jelly she made from the elderberries that grew out by the well. She also made wine out of the elderberries, which Uncle Les liked. But I thought it tasted like one of the medicines called wine of Cordia, which she gave us sometimes. Lucille had told John Dale that she would marry him when she returned from the East. She started getting ready for her wedding. She ordered yards of white satin, fake orange blossoms — you didn't get real ones out in New Mexico — and lots of other materials. She sewed days on end, getting all her clothes made. The folks had built a new 7-bedroom house over the years, and this too had to be prepared for her home wedding. I guess everything went over fine. There were friends and relatives there from both sides of the families. I decided right then and there that if I ever got married, I wasn't going to all that work for 5 minutes. That to me didn't seem that important. In later years, though, I would work my fingers to the bone, so to say, just so that my oldest daughter could have a beautiful church wedding. I started to high school the next year. I would ride the grade school bus 25 miles, then transfer to the high school bus and ride another 25 miles. There would be about 50 of us on the bus. This took a long time for us to be in transit, as there were still only about 8 miles of paved road this side of Carrizosa. Most of the students on the high school bus were boys, and nearly all of them stood 6 feet or over. Looking back, it is with much sympathy that I think of the poor little old man who drove that bus. One time it had rained very hard and the bus became mired in the mud. He made all the boys get out to push, so of course they all got on one side and pushed the bus over into a ditch. We got to school about noon that day, and there was always something traumatic going on. Practically everyone carried a long pin for self-preservation. One day the bus driver put a bunch of the big boys off to make them walk. Later the local bootlegger picked them all up and brought them on to school. They were hanging all over his car, on the running boards, and some were sitting on the trunk. You couldn't see the car for the kids. The bus driver took them to court to have them permanently barred from riding the bus. I didn't go to the trial, but the kids must have won because they continued to ride, and I don't think any of our deportment greatly improved. I started going steady with William. By this time, I guess I'd filled out in the right places. We would go to the movies if he had any money. He and Joe would work all day for one of the ranchers, branding calves or helping in the roundup. They would each get $1 for the day's work. Joe would drive our car to Carrizosa. He and his girlfriend and William and I would stay after school until the movie started. We would sometimes drive out on the Malpais, which is an extinct volcano, to watch the sun go down. Needless to say, we didn't see many movies, for the jobs were sparse and scarce. We all had parties at each other's homes, though, and all the young people came. We played games, and the parents always fixed refreshments. We had dances at the old Hickory schoolhouse, too. There was always 3 or 4 musicians in the area. It was usually a violin, a guitar, and a banjo. We didn't dare sit or lean against the walls of the schoolhouse, as they were full of bed bugs, and our folks would have been more than a little unhappy if we had brought any of them home with us. We always went to the junior and senior prom, too, and I got a new formal each year for it, and this was always a big occasion. William and his folks lived about 6 miles west of Ancho on the way to Carrizosa. They had built a 6-room cross-tie house on their place, which was very comfortable. One summer afternoon, Joy and I decided to go to the movie and take some others with us. We went through Ancho, and since one of our friends, J.D. Ferguson, worked at one of the gas stations there, we stopped and asked him if he would like to go. He said he had to work later. He surely would. We went on and picked up William and Joe's girlfriend and went to the show and reversed our route. When we got back to Ancho, it was around 11 o'clock at night. Lucille was sitting in her car at the depot waiting for John to come in on the midnight train. He worked on the railroad. I got in the car with Lucille, as it had been planned beforehand that I would spend the night with her. John arrived at midnight, and we started out to their place. As we passed the service station, we noticed the lights still on and wondered about it. We went on home and came back to Ancho early the next morning to find E.D. had been shot and was laying beside the building dead. The man who ran the store and gas station had also been murdered. The two killers were tracked down and apprehended. Their horse tracks led close by the depot where Lucille and I had been sitting. We kids all escaped school every day to go to their trial at the courthouse. The principal never said anything. I guess he thought we were getting an education there, too. William and Joe graduated at the end of my sophomore year. William and his parents moved to Arizona, but we wrote letters back and forth to each other. He worked that summer in the Blue Mountains of Arizona punching cattle. When fall came, he and Joe lived with Lolly and Fred over at Socorro and attended the School of Mines. Lolly and Fred then sold the little farm, and William and Joe rented a little adobe house that sat just off campus. It was not a very imposing structure. The adobe was beginning to crumble. The doors and windows didn't fit very well, letting the cold in and the heat out. The cockroaches also had an insatiable appetite. They thwarted this by turning their plates upside down on the table between meals. William's laundry usually came home with Joe's. I once reminded him I was helping by starching his shorts and sewing up the tops to his socks. I was the only one left at home now. We were still milking cows, farming and raising cattle, sheep, and pigs. I helped milk when I got in from school, but the mornings Mom and Papa did it by themselves. I had started driving the car when I was 13, so by this time I was trusted to take the car and do a lot of the errands in town. I dated a few other boys, and my folks knew them well. If I wanted to go to a dance, Mama would go with me and sit talking to some of the other parents while I danced. Papa would never go as he didn't believe we should dance. We still went to revival meetings and singing conventions. I remember one revival meeting they were having in a big tent in Corona. William and Joe had come home from spring vacation. Joe had something else to do, so William and I went with Papa and Mama to the meeting. It hadn't rained in quite some time, and the ground was dry as a powder house. They all got together and started praying for rain. I think they overdid it, for the thunder was soon drowning out the preacher. The rain started coming down in torrents. William and I quietly got up, made a run for the car, and got there just as the whole tent collapsed. Papa got Mama out, and William and I sat in the back seat and laughed as quietly as we could all the way home. I don't think Mama thought it very funny. It was Papa's cousin that was the minister, and it was to hear him preach that we had gone. He was a fine man, though, and later traveled all the way to Washington State to preach my father's funeral. My senior year in high school was not without events and highlights. We took every advantage of our seniority. We put on a school play in which I played the part of an old maid aunt. I remember it being very comical. I would drive the car to school each day that we had play practice. Afterwards, some of us would ride around town in the car. We'd play the radio and listen to the latest songs on the Lucky Strike hit parade. Our class had shrunk by this time. There were only 8 girls and 20 boys left. Many of the boys had dropped out of school to go to work, and most of the girls had left to get married. We made enough money from our senior play to all go to the Grand Canyon, though. Joe was still going to college, and William was working in a mine near Silver City, New Mexico. I graduated in May, and I still remember my gown that I wore to the senior banquet and prom. Mama's cousin in Washington, D.C. had bought the material at Woodward and Lothrop's and had sent it for me. It was a deep rose sheer, and I chose black lace to trim it in. I felt very elegant in it, and that's really all that matters. If you feel good, you usually look good. Joe came home from school for the summer. Papa's sister died near Granbury, Texas, so Mama and Papa went to her funeral, leaving Joe and I to take care of the place. William had some time off from work, so he came, bringing with him a wedding ring. We decided to just quietly get married. I wore a new white skirt and blouse with white sandals. Joe went with us, and we decided to go where no one would even know us. We drove to Estancia, New Mexico, got our license, and were married in a parsonage. It wasn't much of a wedding. Anyway, we had to rush home and get the cows milked. We stayed until the folks got back. They were disappointed that I hadn't had a nice wedding. I told them it was just the way we wanted it. I've read all the definitions of marriage by the famous authors, and I couldn't find one description that could fit us. We were more like a couple of children running hand in hand. We didn't want to miss anything that life had to offer, and it had a lot to offer, and many times not in the way that we would have preferred. We were young and vulnerable, and we trusted everyone and everything. The move over the mountains was the first time in my life that I had moved, that I could remember. I had led a very sheltered life, and I looked forward to all the glamour and excitement of living in a mining town and in a place where I'd never been. The excitement started sooner than I had anticipated, though, and before the trip was over, I'd wished several times to be safely back home. We loaded William's 1937 Dodge Coupe with all my worldly possessions, my clothes, quilts, pillows, dishes, and all the wedding presents our friends and family had given us. We left late in the afternoon and hadn't traveled over 15 miles when we discovered the car's brakes had completely failed. This didn't concern us too much at first because we could gear down, cut the motor, and glide to a stop. In those days, in that country, we'd be lucky to see 2 cars in 100 miles. Then came a torrential rain, and when we got to the Rio Grande River, we discovered the main bridge was washed out. The highway department had posted a sign saying there was a detour to a smaller bridge upriver. The route lay over just 2 rutty dirt roads through ranch land and about 30 miles upstream. We had only gotten started when a herd of cattle dashed across the road in front of us. There was no stopping. We hit the first one, knocking her down and the front wheels passing over her before the car came to a halt. We knew we hadn't killed her because she was bawling and thrashing around under the car. The car was bouncing up and down, and I was sure she was going to come up through the floorboards. William said he thought he could jack the car up and we could get her out. He opened his door and got out just as she managed to push her way out from under the car, jumped to her feet, and went running and bawling across the moonlit prairie. We sat in stunned silence for a while. The way she was running, we deducted she had got the best of the deal, as she had knocked holes in the radiator. Now we had the problem with water leakage. It was a beautiful night, and we were soon sailing across the lush grasslands. We topped the hill, and down below our headlights caught a traumatic sight. There was a high barbed wire gate stretched across the road. There was no way for us to stop on that downhill grade. William geared down, but to no avail. I had time to grab a pillow and put over my face before we crashed. The lower wires broke with a snap and a crack, and the upper wire hooked on a goat ornament that adorned the radiator and sent it crashing through the windshield. We were both covered by showers of glass. I was crying, and William was wrestling the car to a stop. He cleaned the glass off of me and got me consoled enough to continue our journey. We made it to the river, and with dismay we viewed what we had to cross. It was an old rickety wooden bridge, and the floodwaters were just lapping at its top. William eased the car out on it, with me praying to the Lord and promising him how good I'd be if he'd just see us across that river. The good Lord must have answered my prayers, or else he just takes care of little fools, for we made it without mishap. We were both so exhausted and unnerved that we got a motel room in Socorro to spend what remained of the night. The motel room cost us $1, but it didn't even have a lock on the door. William placed a chair under the doorknob, and we retired, only to be awakened a short time later by someone trying to force the door open. William gave him a few descriptive words, and he left. I guess William had learned some new words in the mines, for I'd never heard him use those before. The next day dawned bright and cheerful when we were off to new adventures. We traveled down to Hot Springs and then turned into the mountains. The roads were steep and narrow with many switchbacks. The country was beautiful, though, with tall pine and quaking asp. We saw a car that had gone over an embankment. Somehow William got the car stopped, and we went down to see if we could help. Someone had removed the people, but there were still brains on top of a rock beside the car. I was completely nauseated and once again began to have my doubts. We were coming into mining country now, and I had my first look at the huge open-pit Chino copper mine. The trains that were down in its depth looked so small, like toys down in its depths. Guadalupe Peak rose in the background. You're supposed to be able to see the face of the Madonna on it. Maybe I had the wrong religion because I never could quite make her out. It was only a few more miles to the mine where William worked. This was a mine where you went straight down into the earth. You went down in cages pulled by a hoist on top of a tower. William worked down on the 1,600-foot level when we were married. When we arrived at his home, I got another big shock. It was a big old rambling adobe house without a door or window in it. There was a long veranda across the front, and it seemed many rooms in the back. I never ventured back into them. There were 2 other men who slept somewhere back there, and I'd had about all the surprise as I could stand. We only stayed there for 3 nights, and that was enough for me. He had a big bedroom right off the kitchen. We unloaded all our goods into it. I made the bed with clean sheets and my quilts, and we retired for the night. I was awakened the next morning by voices and peeked out to see an old miner sitting in our bedroom's windowless window. He was sitting there visiting with William. I covered my head and stayed that way until he had abdicated his throne. William took his Dodge into Silver City and traded it in on a nice little 1939 Chevrolet. It had all the parts that the Dodge had been missing, even brakes. It was really a good little car and would serve us well, as we were very mobile youngsters. He also rented us a 2-room apartment in the same building that housed the saloon. From the front, one door went into the bar and the other went into our apartment. We had to keep this one locked, as on several occasions we, as well as the customers, were given a surprise by them coming in the wrong door. There was also a side door out of our kitchen bedroom. William had bought a couch and 2 chairs, a stove, a table with 4 chairs, and a bed with 1 roller broken off, and some odds and ends from a family who was leaving the area. We put a brick under the short leg of the bed, and this leveled it up just right. William had been off work on medical compensation when he came to get me. He had to report to Silver City to go into the hospital for a hernia operation. He rushed to get me settled as he would be hospitalized for a full 10 days. The operation went off very successful. I was making out fine in the apartment. I would get up early, make the 12-mile drive into Silver City, and sit with him all day in the hospital, and return to the apartment about nightfall. I was never in the saloon next door, but I can tell you where the Nickelodeon sat. It was exactly on the other side of the wall from my bed. It would seem that every night, just as I got
To sleep, I would be blown upright to the tune of the Beer Barrel Polka or You Are My Sunshine. I never cooked for myself while he was in the hospital. Just down the hill from it, the drive-in was located. Each night on my way home, I would stop and have a banana split or an ice cream sundae, anything with ice cream in it that could be bought for 25 cents or less. I've never been to a drive-in, and I had all the ice cream I could eat, so I spent all my grocery money indulging myself. This freedom was short-lived, though. About the 3rd day after William's operation, I stopped at a little service station for gas. It was only 3 or 4 doors away from my saloon apartment. The young woman who ran it was very friendly and asked me where I was from. It turned out she had moved there from my hometown and was a good friend of my sister's. She just about died when I told her where I was staying. That night, she and her husband packed me up, bag and baggage, and moved me up in the house with them. They were lovely people. She was of Spanish extraction, and it was from her that I learned to make enchiladas and many of the Mexican dishes we still enjoy. In return, I would make them cream pies, which was about the only thing I knew how to cook. I can make beautiful angel food cakes, too. I'd learned to do these in home ec in high school. To cook substantial meals, I had to learn by trial and error. We had a good stomach, though, and survived it all. The day before William got out of the hospital, his sister LaRue came out from Arizona to stay with us. That night, we went back to the apartment to sleep. The weather had turned quite warm. We left the back door open and just latched the screen door. Sometime during the night, we were awakened by a bunch of drunk Mexican women. They were laughing and talking and going to the bathroom right outside our back door. We slipped quietly out of bed, took the water bucket, and threw the whole pail of water through the screen door on top of them. They thought it was the people in the upstairs apartment that had wet them down. Now, I don't understand much Spanish, but I understand enough to know my upstairs neighbors were called some very nasty names. LaRue had a boyfriend there who was working in the mines for the summer. With his help, we moved back up into the canyon into a 4-room house with windows and doors. That's about all it had. We made kitchen cabinets out of orange crates, and I bought red and white checkered gingham and made curtains for them and curtains for the windows to match. In the bedroom, we put a wire across the corner. I hung a bedspread over it, and this became our clothes closet. My dressing table was 2 orange crates with a piece of wood laid across for the top. I made a skirt for this also, and we had an old mirror to hang over it. We paid $7 a month for rent. We really were pretty ritzy, though. All our neighbors lived in a tent house, which were about 12 by 16 feet. Of course, they didn't have to pay rent. There was a creek that ran behind the house, and we had stepping stones to get across it to the outhouse. I'd use this water for scrubbing the floors, but that was all. A lot of this water was pumped out of the mine and was unfit for consumption. The stream we got our other water from was farther down the canyon. We would tie a wooden barrel on the back bumper of our car and go down and fill it. This stream emptied into the canyon in a beautiful waterfall. Everyone in the canyon got their water from there. We would often meet and visit with our neighbors while filling our barrel with water. After William would go to work, I would often climb out of the canyon and take walks up into the hills. They were beautiful. The peacefulness and silence was just breathtaking. I was always a little frightened, though, of getting snake bit. I knew no one would ever know where to look for me. No one in the canyon had electricity. We used kerosene lamps and took our baths in a wash tub. We went to a washateria to wash our clothes and brought them home and dried them on a line. The mine superintendent gave William a beautiful little fluffy white puppy for me. She went with me everywhere I went. In fact, she was about my only companion. I never got acquainted with any of the neighbors other than just to speak. They were all older. I'd never been accustomed to having people around me anyway, so I was very happy in my solitude. There was one woman that came to call for a while. She was a Jehovah's Witness. She did confuse me for a little time, enough so that I spent hours each day poring through William's Bible. I only owned a tiny New Testament that had been given me one summer by the Presbyterian missionaries in Bible school. I'd already made up my mind from my own study that she was taking words out of context, but she really clinched it for me when she asked me to go to town with her. We went to the grocery store where she brought groceries. I went to the post office to see if there was any mail from home. Next, she stopped at a saloon and went in and bought a bottle of whiskey. She uncorked it and took a big drink and passed the bottle over to me. I couldn't have been more horrified if she'd passed me a bottle of poison. I declined her offer. I'm sure she could read volumes from the expression on my face. When we got back to my house, I politely told her I didn't believe I wanted any more Bible studies. She said something about casting your pearls before swine. I knew she inferred I was the pig, but I knew she just had the shoe on the wrong foot. I was jubilant to be rid of my nemesis. After William had recuperated a little from his operation, and before he went back to work, we went to Arizona to visit his folks. We traveled through the Mogollon Mountains by the way of the Gila River. We went through Springerville and on to St. John's, Arizona. From there, it was about 60 miles across the painted desert country to the ranch where they lived. Near the ranch house was a city of Indian ruins and 2 lakes. One lake had very green water and the other very red. They were only about 200 yards apart. It was said you couldn't sink in the red lake because it was so salty. We would go swimming in it, but I never tested the fact that I wouldn't sink. I knew my capabilities as a swimmer, and I knew if anything would go to the bottom, it would be me. William and I would go horseback riding. There was one area where huge petrified logs were laying in a big depression. They were so symmetrical round its edge that it looked as if it had once been a lake and they just floated ashore and petrified. We helped his folks move from the Long H Ranch, deeper into the painted desert to the Z Bar. This was an old ranch that had been established before the Indian raids. William and I slept in a long log bunkhouse. The windows at the foot of our bed had quite a gruesome history. During one of the Indian raids, the woman of the house had killed an Indian there. As he came through the window, she hit him in the head with a chopping axe. One day, the two of us were sitting in the shade of the corral fence talking. The ground was very sandy. As we talked, we were just running our fingers through the sand. Up came an old hand-loaded bullet. It was a big caliber from what they call the old buffalo guns. We dug around some more and found about 14 of them. I'm sure they'd been there since one of the Indian Wars. Later, William and Joe took out the bullet of one and tested the powder to see if it was still good. They both lost most of their eyebrows and eyelashes from the resulting flash. It was still very active. On our way back home, we stopped in Springerville, Arizona, and visited with a great-aunt of William's. Everyone called her Gram. She was very old, but sharp and spry as could be. She had lived through a number of Indian raids and could tell fascinating stories. She and her daughter lived together. Even her daughter was an old woman. We were told that on Graham's 100th birthday, the newspaper had sent a reporter out to interview her and had found her out behind the house chopping wood. Their house was very interesting. It was filled with massive furniture, and every inch of the floors were covered with hand-woven Indian rugs. I can still see her in my mind as I sat across the room from her. Her hair had once been very dark red and curly, but now was somewhat of a pink, cut short in tight little curls all over her head. She was not a small woman, but was of medium height. She was built kind of square and wore a long black dress of heavy material. It came almost to her ankles. She sat in the massive rocking chair with her feet spread apart. Her little black bulldog was hiding under her skirts and would peek out and growl at intervals. How I wished I had not been so young and shy and could have really talked to her. Her name was Sally Sidney Cathey Martin. She was William's grandfather's older sister. She had been born in Mississippi, and even though she had come to Arizona at an early age, she had lost none of her southern accent. We lived in the canyon for almost a year. The days William had off from work would find us camping high in the mountains or going to see some of our families. We would take some food and bedding and find some isolated spot on some beautiful mountain stream and indulge in all of nature's beauty. We would carry an axe and saw with us and spend part of the time cutting cedar and juniper wood. Our car would be loaded down with it as we both cooked and heated with wood. Joe would come over from school in Socorro and visit us for the weekend. We'd prowl through the hills looking at all the old abandoned mines. I'd always fix some pie, cake, and other food for him to take back to college with him. He quit teasing me so much now that we were grown. William was now doing assay work in the assayer's office. This was to test the amount of gold and silver coming out of the mine, along with the lead and the zinc. He then went back down into the mine as a drill man. This meant he was working the swing shift. He'd be 2 weeks working from 7 a.m. to 4 p.m., and then 2 weeks from 4 p.m. until midnight, and then from 12 midnight until 7 a.m. We gauged our home life according to his hours of work. Winter in the canyon was not very comfortable. The old house was hard to heat. We moved our bed into the living room. Even then, it was hard to keep just 2 rooms warm. The snows could lay on the ground for weeks. I think the people in their little tent houses were now more comfortable than we were. On Friday, December 5th, I rode to Socorro, where Joe was in college with my friend from the service station, and then rode with Joe on to see my folks for the weekend. Coming back on Sunday, we had his car radio on and heard of the bombing of Pearl Harbor. We were now in World War II. Joe already had his private pilot's license, and he immediately enlisted in the Army Air Force. His first school was at Oxnard, California, where he flew the smaller trainer planes. From there, he was shifted from one air base to another until he became a pilot on the B-17, the Flying Fortress. He was first sent to North Africa. He flew from Miami, Florida to Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, across the Atlantic to the North African desert. Here he lived in a tent with 3 other pilots. He bombed in North Africa till Rommel's forces were defeated and then went on to bomb Sicily and Italy. After completing one of his missions over Sicily, he came back to his tent to find himself alone. His other 3 buddies had all been shot down and killed that day. He wrote us very sad letters that night. He had to complete 50 bombing missions before he could come home on furlough. On his 50th mission, his plane was almost demolished. His landing gear was shot off, and there were so many holes in its structure, he had difficulty keeping it in the air and getting back across the Mediterranean to North Africa. There was no way to land it. He kept it in the air until all of his crew had bailed out, and then he tied the controls and tried to make it back to the bomb bay doors so he could jump. It kept slipping and going into dives or turning on its side. Each time he was able to crawl back and right it again. He finally stabilized it enough to make his first parachute jump. When he regained consciousness, he was laying on the ground, and a little French girl was holding his head on her lap. He came home aboard a ship. He sailed from Cairo, Egypt to New York City, and then he became a flight instructor for other pilots and later a communications officer in Florida. The beginning of the war saw the end of our mining experiences. William got a job helping us to build the many new air bases that were needed in the country. We moved to El Paso, Texas, and here he helped build the hangars at Biggs Field. I was now 19 years old and pregnant with our first child. It was summer and the days were hot and humid. We rented a very small apartment in the Isleta Valley. It had 2 rooms and a bath. Our icebox was located in the garage. This made it nice for the iceman, but not so handy for me. I had my first experiences with cockroaches. It seemed regardless of what I fed them, they invaded us by the hundreds. At night, when we turned the lights on, they would scurry across the floor and hide in the walls, only to reappear as soon as the lights were out. In the evenings, we would take a blanket and sit out on the lawn under the oleander bushes, or go to a watermelon stand and eat cold watermelon at their outdoor tables. For 5 cents, we could ride the streetcars all the way through El Paso to the border of Mexico. Then for 2 cents, we could ride the Mexican streetcars all over Juarez. Our financial position had been improved with this changing of jobs. In the mines, William had been working for 68 cents an hour. Now, as a carpenter, he was making 92 cents an hour. We purchased a nearly new car, a 1941 Sky Blue Mercury. By all, our wanderlust had gotten the better of us. We stayed for a short time in Pampa, Texas, and then went on to Clinton, Oklahoma. Here they were building a large naval air station. We settled down for a time. In December, I decided I'd better see a doctor since I was expecting. In January, I thought the doctor would drop his teeth when he asked me who my previous doctor had been, and I told him I'd never seen one before. On January 17, 1943, our baby daughter was born. We were sure there'd never been such a beautiful or perfect one. She had dark auburn hair and bright blue eyes. How we loved and doted on her. When Gayle was about 2.5 months old, Lucille came by train to see us. She stayed about a week and asked me to go back home for a visit. Of course, I was overjoyed at the chance to go home and show off the new first granddaughter. My sisters all had boys. Baby Gayle and I took our first train ride, and I might add I've never ridden one since. In wartime, it seems the whole country was on the move. The seats were all filled, and the soldiers were sleeping in the aisles, and the toilets were plugged, and sewage was seeping down the aisles also. It was terrible, and the train stopped at every little junction. Young women were following their husbands. I remember one in particular. She had a baby only a few months older than mine. She was going to California and had run out of milk for the baby. It was so hungry it cried continuously. She only had an orange for it to suck on. The folks were overjoyed to see us, and we stayed about a week, and then I took the train back to Oklahoma. The trip was equally as harrowing, but not as crowded as going east. In June, William's crew finished their jobs and was moving on to another one in eastern Texas, and wanted him to go with them. This time I wouldn't budge. I didn't want to go. They were gamblers, drinkers, and I understood even worse. We moved back to Alamogordo, New Mexico, and William went to work building at Holloman Air Force Base. We rented a little 2-room house from Lucille in the back pasture. We knew it was only a matter of time until William would be in the service. He had taken the Air Force pilot's test, but was turned down because he was slightly colorblind. We sold our car for a very good price, much more than we'd given for it, since all cars manufacturing had stopped for the duration of the war. Their plants were being used to build tanks and trucks and war equipment. We took the money and bought a little 50-acre place in Carrizosa and an older car. The place cost us $1,200. It had 3 rooms and a screened-in back porch, a well complete with windmill and an orchard, barn, and outbuildings. We were so proud of our first home. We would stay up all hours of the night watering our orchard and enjoying the moonlight shining in the mountain tops and listening to the old steam trains winding their way through the valley. William took some student trips as fireman for the Southern Pacific. Working behind the hot engines gave him bronchitis and had thought that he had to give it up. The fall after I was 21 years old, we left our little house sitting vacant and moved to McNairy, Arizona. William got a job in the sawmill there. That winter was the coldest I have ever spent anywhere. McNairy is located high in the White Mountains, and in the winter the snow never leaves. It would thaw a little during the day, and then the icicles would reach from the roof to the ground. They never completely melted, so each night they became larger. By midwinter, our house had looked like a roof held up by huge ice pillars. By spring, William had enough of the sawmill and was itching to get into the action. He went to Phoenix and joined the Navy. Ironically, when he got his papers back, he was informed the Navy had their quota, so they'd placed him in the Army. We had sold our car to make the move to Arizona. Now we sold all our furniture to the Indians and the Negroes that worked at the sawmill. The folks wanted me to come home and stay with them. They were on the ranch by themselves, and I really didn't have much choice. I had a little girl, a little over a year old. I was expecting a second baby. After being cooped up in the ice cave all winter, I looked like something more dead than alive anyway. Joe was home from North Africa by this time, and he came to Arizona and took us back to New Mexico. William left for the induction center at Fort Bliss, Texas, and I settled down to the long war widow's wait. I can't begin to tell you what a traumatic time this was for me. I said at the time, and I can reiterate it again, I would rather die from having to live through another war. In kissing them goodbye, you know that might be the last time you'll ever see them. At that phase of the war, the possibilities were very negative. William had always played with Gayle, and when he got in from work, they would get on his hands and knees and growl and chase her, and there would be laughing and screaming merriment. After he left, she would get down on the floor on all fours and look around and start to cry. Papa and I would cry with her. I finally got a letter from William telling me he was at Camp Walters, Texas. The Army wouldn't let him write from the induction center. He would be there for 17 weeks. Papa knew how depressed I was, and he made arrangements for me to ride to Bowie, Texas with some distant relatives of his who were visiting in New Mexico. I flew around and packed what clothes Gayle and I owned, and we were off. I had never seen the people before, and I can't remember the young woman's name or the other 2 adults. The man was called Mule. They were what I would call real hillbillies. The car smelled like a chicken roost. Gayle clung to me for dear life and wouldn't let one of them touch her. One of the little boys had a terrible earache and screamed most of the way. The father finally stopped at a restaurant, and the owners heated up some salt in a bag, and they held it on his ear. We drove straight through without stopping to eat or drink, except to get the salt. We were packed in like sardines. I had cookies, crackers, and milk for Gayle, which we shared with the children. Mule was so exhausted, he finally turned to me and asked if I could drive for a while, since I was the only other person in the car who knew how to drive. I took the wheel, and I felt like I was in a nightmare. Here I was, 21 years old, 7 months pregnant, hurtling a jalopy down strange roads at 1 o'clock in the morning and holding Gayle in my lap. She still wouldn't let them touch her. I only lasted about an hour until I was so exhausted I feared for their lives as well as ours. When we arrived at their home, it was a shack in the hills surrounded by deep woods. It had rained hard, and the roof leaked so badly everything in the house, including the beds, were soaking wet. They made some coffee, and we poured a little sugar water in it. The sugar bowl had been left uncovered on the table. I don't think there was any food in the house. I gave them $10, and they seemed embarrassed to take it, and I think they only did so out of necessity. They offered me one of the wet beds, but I declined. They only had 2, which was barely enough for them. I wrapped Gayle in her blanket and we dozed in a chair until daylight while they slept in their soggy beds. The next morning, Mule's brother, called Horse, took me over to an older man's house. I never really figured it out, but he was either a half-uncle or a half-cousin to my father. He had much larger, older home back in the hills. His younger daughter and her little boy were staying with him while her husband was in the army. Their place was so neat and clean, and I was made to feel so welcome. The only thing I was afraid of, Gayle would fall off the back porch, which seemed to be a mile off the ground. Uncle or cousin Sam took me over to his farm. He had lovely orchards and fields, and we brought delicious big watermelons to the house to eat. He ran something like a truck farm, and each Saturday would take his produce to town and sell it. I stayed 2 days and nights with him. The next day, being Saturday, I asked if I might ride to town with him and catch a bus on to Fort Worth. He loaded his produce truck, which was an old car, cut down with a bed built on the back of it. When I got in the front seat with him, I had a few depredations. There was nothing where the floorboards should be but God's green earth. Old Sam was no slouch either when it came to driving. I held on to Gayle for dear life. I don't know what the country looked like around, for I was too intent upon what was passing beneath us. I was going to stay in Fort Worth with a cousin for a few days until William could make reservations for me at the guest house at Camp Walters. I knew my cousins lived on Lake Worth, but due to the wartime restrictions, didn't have a telephone. Mama had written her that I was coming. Of course, she didn't know when, as I didn't know myself. I only had a route and a box number for her address. When I arrived in Fort Worth, I gathered my bags and little Gayle together and set out to find a city bus with Lake Worth on its front. Finally found one and loaded everything on. We traveled for quite a distance before the street addresses changed to mailboxes beside the road. I kept watch of the numbers on the boxes, and when we came to the right number, we got out. The bus left us standing beside the road with our suitcases. I looked around me and I became completely confused. I knew my cousin lived on Lake Worth, and there was no sign of a lake anywhere in sight. There were a few scattered houses, and I could see a man working on his car behind one. I left our bags sitting on the road and picked Gayle up and made my way up their driveway. The man was very kind. When I explained my dilemma, he said all the mailbox numbers had recently been changed. He said he needed to try his car out anyway, so he loaded us in and took us right to my cousin's home. They had a lovely home on the lake, complete with docks and a rowboat. I used a neighbor's phone to call Camp Walters and actually got William on the phone. He had reservations for us for the next weekend. The next Saturday morning found us unloading in a strange and frightening atmosphere. The bus left us in front of the big gate with Camp Walters across its top in wrought iron. There were soldiers with guns guarding its entrance. One of them ushered me into a building by the gate. Here I was interrogated as to my business at the camp. I'm sure I looked like a very dangerous spy on a subversive mission, as I was very obviously pregnant and dragging a blonde, curly-haired tot along with 2 battered suitcases. I had just satisfied them that I was not there to destroy their camp or imperil their lives when I looked up, and here came my soldier husband striding down the road. How good he looked in his uniform. How good he would have looked in any form. We went to the guest house. The name guest house to me always meant a place that was to be gracious to house your guests. What I found was a long barracks-like building with a long hallway with beds on either side, partitioned off by half walls and doors, with a bath at the end of the hallway. There was a cafeteria near the door, though, where I could obtain milk and what food we needed. We were happy. I just knew I could go into Mineral Wells and find us a nice little apartment. How naive I was. I was allowed 2 nights in the guest house. The 3 of us just spent the weekend basking in each other's presence. There were lovely green lawns. We would sit in the sun and talk while Gayle played. The young soldiers all around us looked so sad and serious. Once I was sitting on a bench with Gayle, a young man walked up to me, hung his head, and asked if he could just talk to me. I answered in the affirmative. He sat down beside me and started to cry. He said that his mother had just died the day before and the army would not let him go home, even for her funeral. I cried with him, and I tried to console him the best I could. I wanted to wrap my arms around him and cry for us all. We were all so young, and the world was such a cold and hellish place to be in. Monday morning came, and I had to give up my VIP accommodations. William had to go on with his training. Little Gayle and I set out to find our little apartment. We took the bus into Mineral Wells, and we started our search. We found women and children sleeping in the park on park benches. We went from place to place and could not find a bed. There was nothing to be had. We finally ended up in a run-down part of town, and I spied an old building that I read rooms over the door. The woman at the desk informed me that they had one available. I didn't even bother to look. I immediately paid her a week's rent. She took me up to my room. It consisted of a bed set up at the end of a hall with cardboard boxes tacked up to screen you from anyone who might walk in from the street. I turned down the bed covers and the top sheet was missing. The bottom sheet was filthy, as well as the blankets. I went back and demanded my money back. She informed me there was no refunds. I informed her that I wouldn't put a pig on that bed, let alone my baby. I told her that I would be back. I took my bags and baby and walked out the door and wondered just what we could do. I had nowhere to turn. I spied a taxi driver and asked him if he knew anywhere I might find a place to stay. He said yes. He believed he knew a place a little ways out in the country. We loaded in and he took us out to an old ramshackle farmhouse. An old woman met us at the door and said she had a room she could rent me. I asked to see it, and she took me in what seemed to be a living room with a big fat bed in the corner. It smelled of snuff and old unwashed people. I thought with some airing and some soap and water I could change that, so I took it and paid the taxi driver and brought my suitcases in. Then the horrors began. Gayle needed to use the bathroom, so I inquired as to its whereabouts. I was directed out back where some canvas had been hung around a framework with 2 poles for the seat. Human waste was stacked on the ground under them. I hadn't eaten all day and my nausea overcame me. I came back into my room to find the old lady still there in a rocking chair knitting away. I thought maybe she wanted to visit, so I sat down and took Gayle in my lap. I didn't want her on the floor until I could do something to sterilize it. The door opened and a burly old man came in and said, "Ma, I hear you rented our bed. Where do you think we're going to sleep?" She rose and said, "Now, Pa, don't get hit up. We'll sleep right there on that couch in the corner." It dawned on me then that we were all to share the same room. I was still pondering this dilemma when the renters in another room came to call. It was a woman with a young Mongoloid daughter. The daughter took one look at me and grabbed me around the neck and with a vice-like grip kept screaming, "Mommy, I like this lady," over and over, and I knew then that I'd been brought to a loony bin. When I could entangle myself from the python hold she had on me, I stood up quietly and told the old lady I couldn't possibly discomfort her and her husband by taking their bed. I picked up my suitcases and toddler and I walked out the door to the fresh air. I didn't know if I would have to walk all the way back to town, but I knew that I had to escape. I couldn't carry the suitcases and Gayle too, so I had to gauge my pace to her tiny footsteps. We had only covered a short distance when who should appear on the road but my same little taxi driver. Even though I was delighted to see him, I wondered how many desperate young women he'd collected double fares from finding them a room. I had now paid for 2 rooms and still had no place for my little doll and I to sleep for the night. I decided that the cardboard box was preferable to the nut house. I would wash the sheet and blankets in the bathroom down the hall, and we would sit in the park until midnight until they dried, until I could sleep with one eye open. When I re-entered the rooming house, the owner met me at the door. She had a strange look on her face. She told me she had a better room for me, but that I could only stay 2 nights for the price I'd paid for a week. She said she had it rented after that. I knew then that she thought I had been to the provost marshal office and was cleaning her nose, so to speak. She took me up to a room that had walls, a door that locked, and beautiful bright clean sheets on the bed. I ripped the spread off the bed and turned the top sheet down and placed Gayle in the middle of the clean sheet and gave her milk and Cheerios. I held myself together until William came to see us that evening. As soon as I looked at his face, I just fell all to pieces. I thought he was going to go back to the post and get a machine gun and mow down the whole town. Before I could quiet my sobs enough to tell him we were physically unharmed, but that my nerves had just cracked up after the day's experiences. There are vultures in our society in every echelon that are so willing to pick the bones of the desperate and the downtrodden. I sometimes wonder which is the greater enemy, the one we are gearing up to fight, or the ones waxing fat at home, feeding on the misery of their fellow man. I prayed and prayed that God would find me a way to stay with my husband a little longer. The next day I went to the old crazy water hotel, and they said they could let me have a room for 2 nights. I returned to the rooming house now with the assurance that there were more nights, and I realized that Gayle was the only child in the building. By the end of the second day, I had gotten a look at some of the other women in the rooms. I knew there was a lot of traffic in the halls. I was pretty naive, but I saw the light. Our abode had not been a rooming house at all, but a house of ill repute. I wondered which girl I had displaced to keep the provost marshal away from the door, and if she was now stationed behind the cardboard boxes. Greed on the madam's part had caused a little reshuffling in the house. Gayle and I now moved into the old hotel. I breathed a sigh of relief, but my chain of luck had not quite run out. I sat Gayle on the bed to play with her toys while I proceeded to unpack the few things we would need for a short stay. I sat down on the bed, and as I did, the whole bed parted. The headboard went one direction and the footboard went the other. We fell flat on the floor. It nearly scared Gayle to death. There was only one window in the room. Regardless of how much pressure I applied, it refused to open 1 inch. There was a big old fan in the ceiling which only circulated stale air. It vibrated so that I was sure it was going to decapitate both of us. William came in that evening with the news that he'd found a motel with kitchenette out on the road to the camp. We could move in that day that my rent was up at the hotel. God does answer prayers. My funds were down to just a few dollars except for my bus fare home. I wired Lucille for some money until my allotment check would come through. She sent it back by return wire. William got $12.50 a month. I would get $50 a month and Gayle $30 if the government ever saw fit to send it. We moved into our little motel, and oh, how blissful. William would ride the bus in every evening and stay with us until about 9:30 p.m. He had to be back in the camp by 10. We had a few hours together each evening and then the weekends. I stayed until near the end of November. I took a bladder infection and had to call the army doctor at the camp. He said he'd better make arrangements for my confinement. I told him no, I had to go home. He felt that I was unable to travel. I told him I had to, as I had a little girl less than 2 years old and no one to take care of her. I took the bus for my homeward journey. The buses were worse than the trains. There were jump seats placed in the aisles, and it was a solid packed mess of people from one end to the other. One little girl behind us got sick and vomited. No one could move, so everyone just had to wipe it off. The stench was devastating. I had planned to ride the bus on to Carrizosa, but when I got to Roswell, there was my brother at the door motioning for me to get off. He was being transferred from Walker Air Force Base to Chinook Field, Illinois. He wanted me to drive his car home. He took Gayle and I out to dinner, and we left him at the air base about dark. Gayle and I started home. I felt more zombie than human by this time. I only hoped I didn't wreck his convertible and kill us both before I made the 130 miles. We got to my folks' place about midnight. A week later, little Don was born. Little he was, but seemingly healthy. I did have to add lactic acid to his milk so he could digest it properly. Don was born at my parents' home the 7th of December, and I turned 22 on the 12th of the same month. William finished his basic training just before Christmas and was home for a 10-day furlough before being shipped overseas. His folks came from Arizona to see him and took us all home with them. William's father was an Indian police and deputy sheriff in the White Mountains Apache Indian Reservation. He had given up ranching to become a lawman. This was a vocation he would carry on for many years. He only had to shoot one man. He had a quiet, calm disposition and could talk the drunks and rowdies into submission. He was respected and honored. William caught the train in Holbrook, Arizona, destined for his disembarkment station in San Francisco. Gayle cried so hard when her daddy got on the train, she tried to get on with him. I was devastated. I've never been able to indulge in grief openly. I can only cry from hurt or distress. But grief is a thing so cold, so dry. It warps my soul and leaves me in an abyss so deep. It is bottomless. I cannot live there. The babies and I took the bus back to New Mexico. I received a letter from William saying that he was leaving and that I wouldn't hear from him for a month or more. 2 weeks later, I received another letter telling me he was back in San Francisco. They'd sailed on one of the old Kaiser-built ships and were only out a few days when the boiler blew up. It took them a week to limp back into port. The next letter I got was long in coming. He was on Luzon in the Philippines. From there, he was landed on Cebu. My letters, spasmodically received, were now written from foxholes in the jungles and hills of the island. He was made first scout. It was now up to him to move ahead of his platoon and scout the area before the others advanced. That's the end.